what does it take to shatter the trust of an entire community? Can a man with everything to lose keep his darkest secret hidden forever? In a quiet southern town where everyone knows each other's name, appearances are everything. The sheriff, the man sworn to uphold the law, is a pillar of this close-knit community. But what happens when the lawkeeper becomes the lawbreaker? On the surface, his life seemed perfect. A respected badge pinned to his chest, a devoted wife preparing to welcome their first child, and a town that trusted him without question. Yet, the cracks in this picture-perfect life were there, unseen by most, but unmistakable to those who knew where to look. A late-night emergency would change everything. It started with a single phone call, the kind that sends a chill down your spine before the words even hit your ears. By the time the truth came out, 2 lives would be lost, and the town would never be the same. This is the story of love that wasn't love, of secrets too heavy to bear, and of choices that spiraled out of control. It's a story about betrayal, consequences, and the devastating cost of living a lie. But whose hands were truly stained in the end? Before we begin to untangle the threads of this tragedy, let's take a step back. How did a man celebrated for his integrity find himself at the center of such a horrifying chain of events? How did a seemingly loyal deputy become entangled in a web that would destroy more than just his career? And what about the woman who trusted them both, only to pay the ultimate price? To understand the answers, we must first understand the people, and the lies, that brought them here. The answers are not what you might expect. Toby Grant was born into a legacy of law enforcement. His father, a decorated officer, and his grandfather before him were both men who lived and breathed the badge. From a young age, it was clear Toby was meant to follow in their footsteps. He wasn't just destined for the role, he thrived in it. Charismatic and capable, Toby earned the respect of Greystone County's residents and worked his way up to become the youngest sheriff the town had ever seen. On the surface, Toby embodied everything the community valued: hard work, loyalty, and integrity. But behind the accolades and the uniform was a man wrestling with battles he couldn't name aloud. Greystone County was a place of deep traditions and unspoken rules. In his world, vulnerability was a weakness, and secrets were kept at all costs. His marriage to Lila was another piece of this carefully constructed image. A high school sweetheart, Lila was the kind of woman who fit the part of the sheriff's wife perfectly. Together, they were the couple everyone admired, the kind people used as examples of success and stability. But appearances, as they often are, were deceiving. Toby's struggles ran deeper than most could see. The weight of living up to his family's legacy, his community's expectations, and his own internal conflicts created a pressure he could no longer ignore. Greystone celebrated him, but he never felt truly seen. The life he built was perfect, just not for the man he really was. Lila grew up in a house where love was more of a transaction than an emotion. With a father who left and a mother who scraped by with bitterness in her voice, Lila learned early to look out for herself. She was smart, ambitious, and fiercely determined never to live the life she came from. When Toby entered her world, he wasn't the love of her life, but he was the answer to her prayers. He offered stability, security, and a chance to create a future that didn't resemble her past. She respected him, admired his drive, and believed he could give her the life she longed for. But love? That was something she couldn't force, no matter how much she tried. Their marriage became more about appearances than connection. To the outside world, she was the devoted partner, the soon-to-be mother preparing for a family of her own. But Lila couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. Toby's late nights and the walls he built around his emotions didn't go unnoticed. She began to feel like a supporting character in her own life, a role she never wanted to play. The pregnancy was supposed to be a new beginning. Lila saw it as a chance to create the family she never had, a reason to believe things could still work out. But the nagging doubts in the back of her mind refused to disappear. Darius Kane was the type of man who carried his past like a shadow, always present, always lurking. He didn't talk much about where he came from, and when he did, the details were vague. People in Greystone County didn't ask too many questions, which suited Darius just fine. As a deputy, Darius was charming, quick-witted, and eager to prove himself. But those who worked closely with him noticed something else, a hunger for approval that went beyond the job. He thrived on validation, and when he didn't get it, his insecurities began to show. Toby saw potential in Darius. Their connection started as a mentor-student relationship, the seasoned sheriff guiding the ambitious deputy. But the late-night conversations and shared confidences revealed more than either had expected. For Darius, the bond filled a void he had carried for years. For Toby, it was something deeper, something he couldn't admit to himself, let alone anyone else. The relationship that formed between them wasn't planned, but it became undeniable. What started as camaraderie shifted into dangerous territory, a line neither man had ever crossed before. And with that line blurred, the consequences became harder to avoid. These three lives, so tightly intertwined, were heading toward a collision. Each carried their own burdens, their own secrets, and their own desires. The choices they made, the lies they told, and the truths they ignored would soon converge in a way none of them could escape. It started innocently enough, or at least, that's how Toby convinced himself in the beginning. Long nights on patrol, just the two of them, gave way to deeper conversations. For Darius, these moments were opportunities to peel back the layers of the man everyone admired. For Toby, they were a reprieve from the suffocating expectations of the life he'd built. In the dim light of the patrol car, their conversations drifted from work to personal stories. Darius shared fragments of his childhood, his struggles to prove himself, and his feelings of being an outsider. Toby listened, offering encouragement and advice, yet finding himself opening up in ways he never had before. These late-night shifts became their sanctuary, a space where Toby could let his guard down without fear of judgment. At first, it was just camaraderie, two men bonding over shared experiences. But there were moments, fleeting and unspoken, that hinted at something more. A glance held a second too long. A hand brushing against another. Silence thick with possibilities neither dared to acknowledge. It was during one of these nights that the line was crossed. A quiet moment of vulnerability turned into something neither could undo. The weight of that first step was crushing, but the pull between them became impossible to resist. What followed were stolen moments in the shadows, meetings that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. For Toby, these encounters were a release, an escape from the life he couldn't reconcile with his true self. For Darius, they were validation, a way to claim the attention and affection he craved. But the secrecy of their connection was a double-edged sword, binding them closer while threatening to unravel everything. As their affair deepened, Darius began to push boundaries. He knew the power he held over Toby, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Subtle at first, his demands grew bolder, each one testing the limits of Toby's loyalty. "You can't just walk away from this," Darius would say, his tone equal parts reassurance and warning. "We're in this together now." Toby's guilt festered with every passing day. He told himself it was wrong, that he needed to end it, but Darius had a way of pulling him back. The fear of losing control, of losing everything, kept Toby tethered. At home, Lila began to notice the cracks in the facade. Toby, once attentive and predictable, had become distant. His late-night shifts extended longer than usual, and his excuses felt hollow. She noticed how he avoided her touch, how his eyes seemed to wander past her as if searching for something, or someone, else. Lila's intuition sharpened, picking up on the smallest details. The scent of cologne that wasn't his, the occasional text message he quickly dismissed, the way he hesitated before answering simple questions. She didn't have proof, but she didn't need it. The man she married was slipping away, and she was determined to find out why. For Toby, the walls were closing in. Darius's demands, Lila's growing suspicions, and his own self-loathing created a storm he could no longer control. Every decision he made, every lie he told, only tightened the noose around his neck. But what Toby didn't realize was that his secrets wouldn't stay buried for long. The choices he and Darius made in the shadows were about to come to light, with consequences no one could have foreseen. What do you do when the truth you feared finally stares back at you? How do you react when everything you thought you knew about your life, your marriage, crumbles in an instant? For weeks, Lila's suspicions had been growing. Toby's distant behavior, his late nights, the subtle shifts in his demeanor, none of it added up. She had convinced herself she was imagining things, that pregnancy was playing tricks on her emotions. But deep down, she knew better. One evening, as Toby slept soundly after another long shift, Lila decided to follow the nagging voice in her head. She reached for his phone, her hands trembling. It wasn't the first time she'd thought about doing this, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she couldn't resist the urge to know the truth. The passcode hadn't changed, another detail that gave her pause. Did he think she wouldn't look? Or was he so confident in his secrets that he didn't bother to hide them? As she scrolled through his messages, her heart pounded harder with every swipe. At first, there was nothing, generic texts to colleagues, messages about work. But then she found the thread. A name she recognized, Darius. At first, the messages seemed harmless, short exchanges about schedules and patrols. But as she read further, the tone changed. The words became more personal, the kind of things you don't say to a friend or coworker. Then, there were the photos, private, undeniable evidence of their relationship. Lila's chest tightened as her world collapsed around her. The betrayal was more than she could process. She clutched the phone, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. Anger, heartbreak, and disbelief fought for dominance, each one threatening to consume her. As she sat there, trying to catch her breath, the realization hit her like a freight train. This wasn't just about Toby's infidelity. This was about her marriage, her unborn child, and the life she had built with a man she thought she knew. The next morning, Lila didn't wait for Toby to leave for work. She wasn't sure what she would say, but she knew she couldn't stay silent. She stormed into the kitchen, phone in hand, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Toby, what is this?" she demanded, thrusting the phone toward him. Toby, caught off guard, froze. He glanced at the screen, his face draining of color. "Lila, it's not what you think," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not what I think. Are you really going to stand there and lie to me?" she snapped, her voice rising. "I saw everything, Toby. Everything. Don't you dare try to deny it." Toby's instincts kicked in, and he tried to deflect. "It's just, he's a friend. We were joking around, that's all. You're reading too much into this." But Lila wasn't buying it. "Joking? You call this a joke?" she fired back, holding up the phone. "How long, Toby? How long have you been lying to me?" The argument escalated, each word cutting deeper than the last. Lila's voice trembled with a mix of fury and heartbreak. Toby's defenses crumbled under the weight of her accusations. He tried to justify, to explain, but the truth was undeniable. Finally, he broke down, his shoulders sagging as the fight left him. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Lila's anger boiled over. "Sorry? You're sorry? You've destroyed everything, Toby. Everything. Do you even understand what you've done? To me? To our child?" Her words were like daggers, and Toby could only stand there, unable to meet her eyes. Lila, consumed by rage and betrayal, issued her final warning. "If you think I'm going to sit here and let you ruin my life, think again. I will not be your silent victim." Her threat hung in the air, a promise of the chaos to come. Toby, now fully aware of the consequences, was left with no choice but to face the fallout. But the storm that was brewing would bring far more destruction than either of them could have anticipated. What happens when betrayal isn't just a wound to the heart but a threat to your very life? What do you do when the pain you're enduring has no limits, no boundaries? For Lila, the physical toll of her pregnancy had always been manageable, until now. She began feeling unusually fatigued, her body weaker than she expected for someone healthy. Persistent headaches, swollen glands, and a fever that wouldn't break pushed her to schedule an emergency visit with her doctor. It was during a routine blood test that the bombshell dropped. The doctor, hesitant but professional, delivered the news with the weight it deserved. "Lila, your results have come back. I need to discuss something serious with you." Her heart sank as the doctor's tone confirmed her worst fears. She listened in disbelief as the words were spoken. "You've tested positive for HIV." The world seemed to stop. The doctor's voice became a distant hum, drowned out by the rush of blood in her ears. She couldn't process it. HIV? How? Her mind raced for answers, her breath shallow and panicked. The dots connected themselves too quickly for her to stop them. Toby. His betrayal was no longer just a private devastation, it had reached into her body, threatening her health and that of her unborn child. Her initial reaction was denial. "This can't be right," she whispered, shaking her head. "There must be a mistake." But there was no mistake. The results were clear. And with them came a wave of emotions, fear, rage, and a grief so profound it left her gasping for air. Lila left the clinic in a daze, clutching the test results like they were a death sentence. But as the initial shock wore off, her despair hardened into something else, determination. She refused to be a victim. She wouldn't let Toby's betrayal ruin her completely, and she certainly wouldn't allow him to go unpunished. She began by seeking legal advice, determined to understand her rights and protect herself and her unborn child. Sitting across from a lawyer, she explained everything: the affair, the texts, the photos, and now the diagnosis. The lawyer listened carefully, their expression a mix of professionalism and empathy. "This is serious," the lawyer said, their tone grave. "You have options, but the path forward will not be easy." Lila nodded, her resolve firm. "I don't care how hard it is. He's not going to get away with this." Meanwhile, Toby's world was crumbling. He could feel Lila pulling away, her silence more threatening than her words. When he learned she had sought legal counsel, his desperation grew. He knew that if Lila exposed the affair, and the diagnosis, his career, his reputation, and everything he had built would be destroyed. Lila's determination was a force Toby hadn't anticipated. She was no longer the woman who quietly accepted his excuses. She was someone else entirely, someone ready to fight back, no matter the cost. But the battle between them was far from over. As Lila prepared to confront Toby on a new level, the stakes were higher than ever. And the fallout of their choices would soon reach a breaking point, one that no one could have foreseen. How far would someone go to protect the life they've built on lies? How desperate must a man become to silence the truth he cannot face? Toby Grant's world was unraveling. His secrets were no longer confined to whispers and shadows, they threatened to burst into the light. The affair, the diagnosis, Lila's growing resolve to expose him, it was all too much. Toby knew that if the truth came out, he would lose everything. In his desperation, he turned to Darius. Their shared secrets bound them together, and Toby saw Darius as his only ally. Late one night, in a dimly lit parking lot behind the sheriff's office, Toby laid out his plan. "She's going to destroy me," Toby said, his voice trembling with fear. "Everything I've worked for, everything we've built, it's all going to come crashing down." Darius listened in silence, his expression unreadable. "There's only one way to stop this," Toby continued, his words heavy with implication. "We have to silence her." Darius's eyes narrowed. "Toby, this isn't some case we can bury. This is your wife. Your child. She's not leaving me any choice," Toby snapped, his voice rising. If she goes public, it's over, for both of us. Darius hesitated, the weight of Toby's words sinking in. He had always been willing to go along with Toby's schemes, but this felt different. This was dangerous. Toby, this could get out of hand, Darius said, his tone cautious. We're already in too deep. But Toby was past the point of no return. His fear had transformed into resolve, and he wasn't about to let Lila ruin him. I need you to help me, he said, his voice low and insistent. You're the only one I can trust. Reluctantly, Darius agreed, though unease gnawed at him. The plan was simple: catch Lila alone, eliminate the threat, and ensure no trace of their involvement. But even the best-laid plans can unravel in the face of human error. The night of the murder was unnervingly quiet. Lila sat alone in the living room, sifting through documents she had collected for her case. The faint sound of a clock ticking filled the air, a reminder of the late hour. She didn't hear the door creak open or the hushed whispers from the shadows. Toby and Darius had entered the house, their movements calculated, their intentions clear. In a flash, the silence was shattered. Lila looked up, startled by the sudden presence of her husband and his deputy. Her eyes widened with fear as she realized what was happening. Toby, what are you doing? She demanded, her voice trembling. But Toby didn't answer. Instead, he lunged toward her, his actions cold and deliberate. Darius stood. Lila fought back with everything she had, her screams echoing through the house. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, and the struggle grew more violent with each passing second. But Toby was relentless, his desperation driving him to commit the unthinkable. When it was over, the room was eerily still. Lila lay motionless, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Toby and Darius stood over her, their breaths ragged, their faces pale with the realization of what they had done. As they scrambled to clean up the scene, a sound broke through their panic, a neighbor's voice calling out from outside. Is everything all right in there? Toby froze, his heart pounding. They hadn't accounted for witnesses. The neighbor, sensing something was wrong, called 911. The emergency operator could hear the tension in their voice as they described the noises and the unsettling silence that followed. Within minutes, flashing lights illuminated the quiet street, and officers arrived at the scene. Toby and Darius were gone, but the evidence they left behind told a story more damning than they could have imagined. The brutal murder of Lila Grant wasn't just a crime, it was the unraveling of a web of lies and betrayals that no one could escape. The truth was out, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The call came in just after midnight, a neighbor reporting suspicious noises from the Grant residence. Officers arrived within minutes, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached the house. The front door was ajar, a sign that something was very wrong. Inside, the scene was chilling. Lila's lifeless body lay on the living room floor, her face pale and expression frozen in terror. The room bore the signs of a violent struggle, overturned furniture, shattered glass, and blood stains that told a harrowing story. One officer stepped back, his voice low as he spoke into his radio. We have a possible homicide. Send forensics. But the weight of the discovery didn't stop there. In the corner of the room, a small sonogram photo lay crumpled among the chaos, a heartbreaking reminder of the unborn child who also lost their life that night. As law enforcement began their work, the scene started to tell its story. The struggle had been brutal, the assailants desperate. But in their haste, they left behind details they hadn't accounted for, a partial footprint near the back door, a smudged fingerprint on a broken vase, and a trail of fibers leading toward the exit. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't just a random break-in or a spur-of-the-moment crime. This was calculated, and the answers would soon come to light. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives interviewed neighbors, who reported hearing muffled shouting and a car speeding away. One witness described seeing two men leaving the house, their movements hurried and suspicious. Toby's involvement as both the sheriff and Lila's husband immediately put him under scrutiny. He arrived at the scene feigning shock, but his performance raised more questions than answers. "Toby, where were you tonight?" one detective asked, his tone measured but firm. "I was at the station, working late," Toby replied, his voice steady but his eyes darting nervously. But Toby's alibi began to crumble when detectives reviewed surveillance footage from the station. The cameras showed him leaving hours before the murder took place. The inconsistencies didn't stop there. Forensic evidence from the crime scene began to tie Darius to the house. A strand of hair matching his was found on Lila's clothing, and fingerprints on the broken vase matched his as well. Then came the phone records. Detectives traced a series of calls and messages between Toby and Darius on the night of the murder. The messages painted a damning picture, two men coordinating their movements, their desperation evident in the hurried exchanges. As the evidence mounted, the story began to unfold. The affair between Toby and Darius, their fear of exposure, and their desperate attempt to silence Lila, all of it pointed to a premeditated crime. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Toby Grant, the man they had trusted to uphold the law, was now at the center of a brutal murder investigation. And Darius, the deputy who had once seemed so loyal, was implicated as his accomplice. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was public, shaking the very foundation of Greystone County. But as the case came together, one question remained: how far would Toby and Darius go to cover their tracks, and could justice truly be served for Lila and her unborn child? The trial of Sheriff Tobias Grant and Deputy Darius Kane gripped the nation, transforming the small southern town of Greystone County into a hub of media frenzy. Cameras flashed as the two men were led into the courthouse, their faces devoid of the confidence and authority they once projected. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The prosecution began by laying out the damning evidence with precision and clarity. Surveillance footage, phone records, fingerprints, and forensic analysis painted an irrefutable picture of the crime. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lead prosecutor began, pacing the courtroom, "this is not just a case of betrayal. It is a calculated, cold-blooded act of desperation. Toby Grant and Darius Kane conspired to silence Lila Grant, a wife, a mother-to-be, and an innocent woman whose only crime was seeking the truth." Witness after witness took the stand, including forensic experts who detailed the evidence. The courtroom fell silent as photographs from the crime scene were displayed, images that left even the most stoic observers shaken. But it was the testimony from Lila's family that left the deepest impact. Her younger sister, Melanie, took the stand, her voice trembling as she described the kind of person Lila was. "She was strong, but she didn't deserve this," Melanie said, tears streaming down her face. "She was finally finding her happiness, building a family. Toby took that from her. He took everything." The prosecution's case was airtight, but the defense attempted to redirect the narrative, painting Darius as the primary instigator. Toby's lawyers argued that he had been manipulated, his judgment clouded by fear and pressure from Darius. Darius's defense team, in turn, sought to minimize his role, portraying him as someone coerced by a superior officer. The courtroom drama unfolded with pointed accusations, emotional outbursts, and the unrelenting weight of the evidence. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before delivering their verdict, guilty on all counts for both Toby and Darius. The day of sentencing brought a somber mood to the courtroom. The judge, stern and deliberate, addressed the defendants with words that cut like a knife. "Tobias Grant, you were entrusted with the safety and well-being of this community. You swore to protect the innocent and uphold the law. Instead, you abused that trust in the most egregious way. Your actions have brought pain and devastation to this town and to the family of Lila Grant. For the double murder of your wife and unborn child, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Toby sat motionless as the sentence was read, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. The judge then turned to Darius. "Darius Kane, while your role in this tragedy is undeniable, the court recognizes your cooperation during the investigation. However, the gravity of your actions in the double murder of Lila Grant and her unborn baby cannot be ignored. For these crimes, you are also sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted into a mix of emotions: relief for the justice served, sorrow for the lives lost, and anger at the betrayal that had shaken their community. As the two men were led away in handcuffs, the final chapter of this tragic story was written. The sentencing of both men to life in prison ensured they would never walk free again. The trial and sentencing may have brought closure to the case, but the impact of Lila's loss would linger, a haunting legacy of the choices that led to her untimely death. The community of Greystone County would forever carry the scars of the betrayal, lies, and violence that had shattered its foundation. The small town of Greystone County was forever changed. What was once a place of close-knit families and unshakable trust had become a community grappling with betrayal on a scale they never imagined. The news of Lila Grant's murder and the revelation of Toby Grant's secret life sent shockwaves through the town. The man they had relied on to uphold justice was now a convicted murderer. It wasn't just the loss of Lila and her unborn child that the community mourned. It was the loss of their faith in the very institution meant to protect them. People questioned how they could have been so blind, how they had missed the warning signs. The scandal became a painful reminder that even those who appear the most trustworthy can carry the darkest secrets. In the wake of the trial, the sheriff's office underwent a complete overhaul. New leadership was installed, and stricter protocols were implemented to prevent any misuse of power. But no amount of change could erase the stain left behind by Toby's actions. The tragedy of Lila Grant's death was not just a story of betrayal, it was a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of lies, desperation, and the lengths people will go to protect their reputations. Toby and Darius's choices didn't just ruin their lives, they shattered countless others, leaving scars that would never fully heal. Lila's family, her friends, and the child she never got to hold were all victims of a truth that was too painful for one man to face. In the end, the question lingers: what price is too high to pay for the truth? How far would someone go to protect a facade, and at what cost to those around them? This story reminds us that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys lives. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more in-depth narratives. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories to light.